Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. In this video, we are going to talk about how to set up and execute a perfect hip thrust specifically to target the glute max, both the upper glute max and the lower glute max. So jumping right into it, first of all, this is a machine hip thrust that I'm going to show, but just recognize that all of the things we're going to talk about are principled. So they apply to machine hip thrusts, they apply to free weight hip thrusts, Smith machine hip thrust, cable hip thrust, any version of a hip thrust to target the glutes. These are the principles you want to follow. So first things first is load placement. In this particular context, we have the load that we're using here, right, on the plates, and it's sort of entering our bodies or touching our bodies through this particular strap. And the placement of this strap, or in the case of a free weight hip thrust, the barbell, hopefully it has a pad on it or something, should be basically as close to on top of the hip joint as possible. And there's not a super simple way to go about finding this landmark because people have different structures on the front side of their hips. Some people have pelvises that have a little bit more of a jutting out kind of a structure. Some people have pelvises that are less so. So some people might find comfort in different positions. Basically just try to find exactly the point around which you're pivoting, which you'll find as you start to go through the motion. So I'll allow this to play here for a second. And what you'll notice is as you come down, and we'll talk about all sorts of other, technique tips. And by the way, this is a video for my exercise library, so there are some instructions layered on top of this. You can just, either look at those or safely ignore them. But in terms of the strap placement, again, you basically just want to place the strap as close to being on top of the hip as possible. You don't want it too low and you don't want it too high, but oftentimes this is a comfort thing that you'll figure out pretty quickly the second that you start to add more load. So the next thing that we need to think about is foot position, and specifically foot position as it relates to the angle of the shin, right? Because that's how ultimately we're pressing down through any platform. And so what I want you all to recognize is that I am, for the most part, throughout the entire range of motion at any point in this exercise, pretty much maintaining a shin angle that is roughly like this, right? Roughly 90 degrees from the foot plate, right? Although at this particular point, my shin is angled slightly backward, that's perfectly fine. We basically just want it to fall sort of in this window here, or maybe slightly behind, that's probably okay too. But basically the reason that you want to do this is because if you move your foot too far forward or too far backward, you're going to start to recruit muscles of the knee to a greater degree, right? So think about this, again, this 90-degree angle here. If we were to move away from this 90-degree angle, if the shin were to be at this angle here, super forward, where the foot would be over here, I know in this context, the platform is small enough to where I wouldn't be able to do that, but many platforms are bigger. And again, if you're doing a free weight hip thrust, you'll be able to move your feet wherever. So if your shin were at that angle, or if your shin were kind of at this angle over here, right, where your shin was really far forward, you're either going to be recruiting a ton of quads, right, in the instance where your foot is really far away from you, depending on how you're pushing through your foot, or you're going to be recruiting a ton of hamstrings, right? Again, depending on specifically where you push through your foot, because it can really change. It's not a simple this equals this type of thing. So long story short, there is basically just find this sort of 90-degree angle and try to maintain it throughout the entire range of motion so you can just drive directly down into the platform. So if you watch me go about this motion, you can see that my shin basically doesn't move from this position pretty much the entire time. So there's very little motion, as you can see, happening at my knee, maybe just a little bit at the top, but it's really only occurring at the top as a consequence of me shoving my hips upward toward the ceiling. So again, first things first, make sure that pad placement or bar placement is comfortable. Second thing second, make sure that your shin stays roughly 90 degrees through the whole time. Now, the next thing that it is really crucial to pay attention to, this might be one of the most important things, especially for those of you who have had bad experiences with hip thrusts, is I want you all to notice the relationship between my torso right here and my femur. And watch basically how at no point does my torso start to kind of slump off in this direction, right? I'm making an extreme point here, right? Not that my spine could bend that much, but basically my torso is staying like a rigid sort of piece of wood the entire time. And I'm allowing my chest and my rib cage to come down as I lower, and then everything is coming up and sort of around the pad as I raise. So I'll let this play now so you can see. What you'll notice is basically at all times, my sternum is pointed in the exact same direction as the top of my pelvis, right? So sternum is pointed forward, pelvis is pointed forward, and I'm actually gonna leave those arrows there. So watch what happens to the arrows. So as I get to the top, make these arrows a different color, my sternum is now pointed up, and guess what? My pelvis is now pointed up. If what happens is, I'll clear all these, if what happens is your sternum goes up, but your pelvis, due to the fact that your spine is you're kind of allowing your spine to flop downward like that, like you're arching your back, your pelvis will be facing this way. And I'm not gonna go ahead and say that that's like super detrimental or anything, or that it's going to cause pain, but what it will cause is a lot more erector and ab recruitment. In other words, people who tend to do this slumping thing right here tend to actually feel a lot of stuff in their abs and their erectors, i.e. just their entire trunk. And so people end up turning this into a trunk exercise as opposed to a glute exercise. So much, you know, in the same way that in an RDL, like let's say like a barbell RDL or something, you would want to keep your spine relatively rigid so that you could load your glutes most directly and so that you're not just moving through your spine. You want to do the same here. Okay, so keep that rigid thing, keep this rigid thing, make sure the chest is pointed in the same direction as the pelvis the entire time, and make sure that that relationship remains the same as you lower down and as you raise up. Now, before we get to the final tips related to execution, we're gonna go back to this unflattering angle here so that you can see precisely what I'm allowing the femurs to do from a sort of front perspective. So I don't have my stance super, super narrow, right? The feet are not like touching each other. They're also not super wide. So a lot of people naturally will put their feet sort of all the way out here and all the way out here. And what they will sort of do in that particular case is they'll limit the range of motion toward the top. Basically just, it's a hip range of motion thing. It's a hip structure thing. So as you get to the top, allow your femurs to roll out kind of in that direction so that you can continue to hip extend as far into that glute shortened position as possible, because that is the primary benefit of this exercise, is training that short position. So don't sort of force your femurs in any particular position. Put your feet, you know, relatively hip width, maybe slightly wider for comfort. This is kind of where I am most comfortable. And then basically just, again, driving through the platform, which we'll talk about how to do that in just a second, allow your femurs to roll outward toward the top if they are more comfortable that way, and if you get range of motion increased into the top doing that, which many of you likely will, just based on normal hip structure. So then in terms of final tips of execution, something I find very, very crucial, and this is something that needs to be sort of taken into account after you have all these setup cues down, right? Like you're not gonna be able to do a hip thrust appropriately for the glutes if your shin, for example, is not close to this 90 degree, or if your back is sort of rounding in either direction, as we already discussed. But in terms of execution and your intent, in terms of how you're going to cue yourself to perform this motion, what I want you all to avoid is that idea of sort of scooping the hips upward in this direction. It can work okay for some people. Some people feel like better sensations when they do it. But again, that is going to be something that is going to encourage this sort of flopping around of the spine, right? Because think about what tucking your hips does. It's like a dog taking a shit, right? Tucking your tailbone is going to be something that occurs as spine motion, not as hip motion. So as you initiate this motion, you want to imagine just driving your heel and driving the midfoot down at a perfect 90-degree angle in line with that shin throughout the entire time. And then as you get to the top, you actually want to use your back. It sounds counterintuitive, but if you get to the top and you're not thinking about actually driving your back that way, your spine might, instead of being rigid, go floppy again. So at this top position, you're thinking about, okay, here's the load, but ultimately what you're really doing with the load is you're using it as a sort of like tenting device through which you can drive down with the heels perfectly 90 into the foot plate, and then with the upper back directly down into the pad behind your back, or the bench if you're using something like a bench. And basically this is what is going to allow that load to go directly to the hip, and again, not to the spine or any of the muscles around the knees. So if you found this video helpful and you want to learn more about biomechanics, you can check out the link in the description to see my 30-day beginner biomechanics course. It's made for the individual with no experience whatsoever learning this stuff. It'll take you basically from zero to hero with all this knowledge, and you can basically learn all the things that I'm talking about in this video from a principle-based standpoint, so that you on your own can sort of troubleshoot exercises with a knowledge of anatomy and physics that's pretty much impossible to learn in any sort of formal education system.